Hey guys, time for another vlog. Glad you're with me. I am journeying through our study on finished work eschatology. Thanks for all the response we're getting. People seem to really be excited about this and see where we're going next. So this is number 3, so I encourage you, if you've missed the first couple, you can find them at my website or at my Facebook page. And I want to start by doing some lead-in. We've been working our way up to what will be our key text of Matthew 24. And I want to try to get us towards that goal, but I'm purposely go really slow because I think we rush into this and we mess it up. So we want to take our time and get there properly. To do that, I want to lead you in with Matthew 23 and the significance of Matthew 23. Of course, we had the wicked tenants parable from Matthew 21. We didn't deal with the wedding feast parable of 22, which is definitely worthy, but I don't want to get stuck. So the scribes and Pharisees begin to hold a conversation with the Lord, and Jesus begins, he turns after their conversation to the multitudes, to his disciples, and to all of the crowd, and he proclaims a series of woes, W-O-E, woes, against the scribes and Pharisees. There's a woe in verse 14, 15, 16, 23, 25, 27, 29. All of these are woes. He even finishes the woe passages in verse 33 with, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? And he's talking to scribes and Pharisees. He's talking to the leaders of Judaism of that day. So that leads us into the statement of Jesus that will head towards the close of 23, that will set up the disciples' question of 24. And it says this in verse 34 of Matthew 23. Therefore, indeed, what therefore? Therefore, due to all of the woes that I've just told you, therefore, indeed, I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So Jesus talks about a pending judgment. That pending judgment piques the curiosity of his disciples, and they will ask in the 24th chapter when that's going to happen. I'll tell you, according to what Jesus just said, why it was going to happen, and we'll deal with the when in a moment, and of course deeper into Matthew 24. Why it's going to happen is because, 34, I sent prophets, wise men, scribes. Some of them you'll kill, crucify, some of them you'll scourge and cast out, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from Abel to Zechariah. All that's why, because of what they're going to do to reject the gospel. Assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So this is actually a prophecy of what is about to occur, that I'm going to send wise men, prophets. You're going to kill and crucify them. Now, crucify tells us that this was out in the future, because crucifixion was a mode of execution that was only just then becoming popular. We look at crucifixion, we see Jesus. They had not crucified Jesus. And so Jesus is saying, you're going to get another chance to get this right, but the issue is you're not going to get it right. You're going to kill and crucify those I send you, which is exactly what happened in the generation between Jesus and AD 70. There was killing and crucifying of the messengers of Christ that were sent to try to restore Judaism into the faith of Jesus Christ. They rejected it. And so Jesus says all of the righteous blood ever is going to come upon 36, this generation, not a future generation, but the generation that was standing in front of him at that moment. Now, where we get into a lot of trouble is when we try to superimpose ourselves into Scripture. We see a text and we say, well, people are persecuting, so this generation is going to be in trouble. Well, that's not what Jesus says. Jesus is specifically referring to that generation, not my generation, not a generation out in the future. One of the most disturbing things for me in my coming up in eschatology and my coming up in dispensational eschatology was that it always bothered me that God would take out wrath on Israel after the rapture and in the tribulation. He would take out his wrath on a people that had nothing to do with the death of his son, and he would do it, and this is what we taught. He's going to judge Israel for rejecting Jesus. And I would think, why didn't he judge the Israel that rejected Jesus? Why would he come and judge the Israel a couple of thousand years later? It doesn't have anything to do with rejecting Jesus. It's not in the nature of God to work that way. So something's wrong. Well, the something that's wrong is we've sort of superimposed ourselves onto that generation. And this isn't proper and it isn't right. Now watch the next thing Jesus says that will give you the heart cry of the Master. Matthew 23:37, the very next verse. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. This is a prophecy that Jesus, or this is a statement Jesus is making to and about Jerusalem. And he says, I have so often wanted to gather in the product of Jerusalem, but you're not allowing me to gather them in. So what's the end result of that? Verse 38. See, your house is left unto you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The heart cry of Jesus, I'm going to deal with two things here. The heart cry of Jesus is Jerusalem, Jerusalem. There's just something special about saying the name twice. Saul, Saul. Samuel, Samuel. This amazing analogy of David, or in my mind it's an amazing analogy of David losing his son Absalom to rebellion, and then when he hears about the death of his son who's trying to overthrow him, his heart cry is Absalom, Absalom, and just that piercingness of a father who'd lost a son that he loved. Jesus has that as he pleads over Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem. The second important thing is, if you'll go back and study the Old Testament, when God talks about the temple, it's always his house. Whenever David builds it, he's building a house for the Lord, the Lord's house. Or when David wants to build it. When Solomon actually builds it, he builds himself a house and he builds the Lord a house. And everyone in Israel knew that the house of God was the temple. I was, in my youth, when we would go to church, we would hear, welcome to the house of the Lord. Well, that was way back in my youth. As I grew older in the faith, we started to realize that it wasn't really the house of the Lord. It was a building, and we were the house of the Lord. But it was very popular to say, this is the Lord's house. And we get that from the Bible, where God's house is the temple. It did not belong to Israel. It did not belong to the priesthood. It did not belong to this earth. It was heaven on earth. It was a special place. In Matthew chapter 23, verse 38, Jesus says, see, your house is left to you desolate. He doesn't call it my Father's house. Because in John 14, when he says, in my Father's house are many mansions, he goes on to talk about making his mansion inside of the believer. So the Father's house is not the same as God's house of the Old Testament. God's house of the Old Testament, a temple made out of stone and marble. God's house of the New Testament is a place where he dwells with believers. What Paul would say in 1 Corinthians 6, you are the temple of the Holy Spirit. So Jesus declares, your house has left you desolate, meaning from now on, it doesn't belong to Dad. It belongs to you. And if it belongs to you, I can tell you there's nothing in it. Your house is left to you desolate. When we get into the 24th chapter, you'll see that Jesus talks about the temple being torn down and not one stone being left unturned. That's a direct result of the temple being Israel's house and not God's house. So when Jesus walks out, he says that temple is left to you desolate, or your house is left to you desolate. it's a good time to throw this in. If that temple is no longer the house of God, and thank God because there's no temple there, then you're the house of God, and He's supremely happy to be in His house. We have this Americanized version of the gospel where we actually think that Israel's looking for a temple to be rebuilt over there. They're not. I think a lot of people are because they think it fits prophecy. But I don't understand why we adhere to an idea that God would go to all the effort to move inside of man. He moved out of tabernacles into temples and then into man, also that He can come and have a temple, move out of man and into the temple. So God's not looking for a temple made of stone. He already has a temple made of men's hearts. And any other temple has been left to you or me, and it's desolate of God's power and His presence. So that was very fitting for Jesus to throw in before we get into the meat of that 24th chapter. Now, I don't want to get into the meat of that yet because there's something I want to show you from Luke. And then next week, Lord willing, we'll move into the 24th chapter of Matthew and begin our verse by verse. Luke chapter 19. And this happens just before Jesus cleanses the temple. He stands outside of Jerusalem and He weeps over Jerusalem. And this is after His triumphal entry. Remember when we just read Matthew 23, He said, you won't see me again until my triumphal entry, until they say, blessed is He who comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna. So Jesus now enters Jerusalem. Luke picks up the narrative slightly after the entrance of Jesus, but slightly before the cleansing of the temple. In Mark's narrative, we don't get this statement. We do get the cursing of the fig tree, the clearing of the temple, and then the comment on the fig tree. But watch this from Luke 19, verse 41. Now as He drew near, He saw the city, and He wept over it, saying, if you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes. For days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you, and close you in on every side, and level you and your children with you to the ground. And they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation. Did you catch that? Jesus tells them exactly how Jerusalem is going to fall. He tells them that you're going to see enemies build an embankment around you, surround you, and close you in on every side. When we get there, you'll see that this is historically documented that these things happened in AD 70. And they're going to level you and your children inside of you. This is important because when we get to Matthew 24, Jesus is going to give a warning to everyone who will listen to flee when they see Jerusalem come past. And that means that the Christians are actually going to be given a way out. We'll understand why He says, pray that your flight be not in winter, or pray that it be not on the Sabbath. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but speaking to a Jewish audience who, if you're trapped in Jerusalem and the gates are closed on Sabbath, which they were, you're in trouble. So He's giving these warnings, these telltale signs. They're going to level you with your children inside of it to the ground. They're not going to leave one stone upon another. Why? Because you did not know the time of your visitation. So Jesus is saying, I have visited you, I have loved you, but you haven't known the time of your visitation. You're going to reject me. And then when you couple it with Matthew 23, I'm going to send scribes, prophets, you're going to scourge them, beat them, kill them, crucify them, and then all the righteous blood of the earth from Abel to Zechariah is going to be poured out on this generation. So the prophecy has already been laid out before you even get to Matthew 24. You already have the framework for why Matthew 24 exists, why the disciples even asked the question. Now, a little bit of history. From Antiochus Epiphanes, which was in 185 BC, who attacked and destroyed the temple, to AD 70. Until that time, and Herod had rebuilt the most glorious temple, the one that Jesus is looking at, Israel was in a backslidden state. She was slowly but surely sliding as far away from God as possible. By the time Jesus comes, she doesn't even closely resemble the nation that Moses brought out of the land of Egypt, not even remotely. There's such a misunderstanding of the law. There's such a misapplication of who God is. It's so confusing that Jesus works most of his ministry just trying to restore a proper picture of the Father, and the disciples still don't get it. In John 14, they say, it would satisfy us if you would just show us the Father. And Jesus says, how long do I have to be with you before you realize if you see me, you've seen the Father? I want to read from a commentary. I'll do some of this as we go. I like to read from historical writings. This will be the first direct read we've done in any of these vlogs, but this is from John Calvin's commentary on the book of Daniel, and I think it's fitting as we head into the end here. After his time, and by his he's referring to Antiochus Epiphanes, the Jewish religion was more and more injured, not only by foreign enemies, but by their own priesthood. Nothing remained unpolluted, since their avarice and ambition had arrived at such a pitch that they trode underfoot the whole glory of God and the law itself. Now, the reason I wanted to read that is to show you that way back a few hundred years ago, John Calvin, writing his commentary on Daniel, realized the connection between a backslidden Israel and the need for that Israel to undergo the days of vengeance. One more real quick thing today, and I'll conclude. In the book of Isaiah, whenever Jesus is handed the scroll on his synagogue morning to read, in the book of Luke, I'm already in Luke 19, so let's backtrack just a little bit. In Luke chapter 4, they hand Jesus Isaiah. He opens it to this, what we would know as the 61st chapter. And he reads that famous, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me." And then when he ends, he says, "To proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." However, if you go back and read from Isaiah 61, what you'll notice, verses 1 and 2 is what Jesus was reading. But when he gets to verse 2, it says, "To proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." And then he stops reading, "and the day of vengeance of our God." He doesn't read that. Now, what has been taught, even in some grace circles, is that Jesus doesn't read the day of vengeance line from Luke, in Luke chapter 4, verse 19. He just stops with "to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." A lot of grace ministers will say, well, Jesus didn't say anything about the day of vengeance because that's coming up in our future. But then they'll turn right around and say God's not mad. The reason why Jesus doesn't say it in Luke chapter 4 is because Jesus saves it for that day of vengeance passage that we talked about in our first finished work eschatology blog back in Luke chapter 21, when Jesus says, when you see this happen, you'll know it's the day of vengeance. So Jesus, early in his ministry, is not proclaiming the day of vengeance. He's proclaiming the acceptable year of the Lord. But once he's rejected by Jerusalem, he then changes in Luke 21 and says the day of vengeance is coming. And then in Matthew 23 he says it's going to come on those who scourge and kill the prophets and crucify those that are sent to them. All the righteous blood of the earth is going to be required of them. And it's going to happen on this generation. Now that so intrigued the disciples. Possibly they were there when Jesus read from Isaiah 61, but way back in Luke 4. They're definitely there in Luke 21 when he says the days of vengeance. They're there in Matthew 23 when he has the woe against the Pharisees, woe against the scribes. And it piques their curiosity to the point that they want to know more. They want to know when these things will come to pass. Next week on the vlog, we're going to start to answer that question. We'll begin our verse-by-verse examination of Matthew 24. In the meantime, if you have a question, something you'd like for us to try to cover, a lot of the questions that have been coming in are way out ahead of where we want to be. But if we said something this week you'd like clarified, we'd like to go into that. You can reach us at info@paulwhiteministries.com. Again, don't be offended if I don't get on and reply via social media to things. It's just not my way. But you're encouraged to pass them around and share them. And some people said they're saving them and they're going to record them all and use them. Great. I hope they're a blessing to you. It's been fun for me. We'll try to have another one up for you sometime next week. I hope that it has been a great experience for you as well. Grace and peace. God bless you.